and welcome to Boost CYAC's new webinar series. This is McKeon, and I will be hosting the webinar today. Before we begin our session, there are just a few quick housekeeping points. For participants listening in French, click on Floor at the bottom left of the screen and select French. To see and follow along with the PowerPoint presentation in English, click Presentation on the top left of your screen. To follow along with the presentation in French, download the French version of the presentation by clicking on the documents on the right. Feel free to download the presentation in both English and French by clicking on Documents, again on the right. There will be a Q&A during the last 5 minutes of the webinar. To submit your question, please go to the toolbar on the right, click on Messaging, and then Participants, and type in your question. You can submit your questions at any time. If you're watching this webinar in a group, please enter the number of participants in the group by clicking on Messaging and then Participants. We will now begin our discussion. So today's discussion is called 7 Myths Busted, What We Learned from Talking to Canadian Teens About Sex Ed. Now, I will begin by telling you a little bit about myself and also the magazine. And I will also begin by telling you that I have a bit of a cold, so hopefully I will not interrupt myself too much with any sniffles or drinking water, but please excuse me and bear with me about that. I guess it's that time of the year. So as I just mentioned, my name is McKeon, and I'm the digital editor at the Walrus. For those of you who are not familiar with the Walrus, we are Canada's national general interest magazine. You can think of us as sort of Canada's New Yorker or Canada's Atlantic. So we cover issues across the country in very in-depth, long-form, fact-based ways, both online and in print. We're also a registered charity. So we publish, as I just said, independent fact-based journalism, both online and in print. But we also produce ideas-focused events, including our flagship series, The Walrus Talks, which some of you may or may not have been to. They tour across Canada. And we also train a lot of emerging professionals in publishing and not-for-profit management. So we're really, we're invested in the idea that a healthy society relies on informed citizens. And last year, that became a lot of discussion about sex ed in Ontario, but also across the country. So I'm just going to tell you a little bit about how we started this project that had us talking to teens across the country, many teens across the country, and what we learned. So in 2018, as many of us remember, there was the height of the latest controversy over sex ed in Ontario. But we also began to think it's probably not just in Ontario. Across Canada, people are looking at what sex education means in school at all ages. And, as part of that, we began to ask, there's a lot of discussion about what parents want or what teachers want or what the government wants, but a lot of the voices that were missing were the voices of youth themselves. And we began to think, well, what do youth really want? And what do kids actually want to learn? And we realized that we didn't know. And, we could look at studies and maybe learn a little bit there. And we could talk to parents about what they think they wanted their kids to learn. But nobody was really talking to kids themselves. And we realized that that was a big hole in our understanding of what sex education should look like going forward. If we wanted to know the best way to approach sex education in Ontario and in Canada, how could we really answer those questions without actually talking to youth and finding out not only what they wanted to learn, but what they felt they weren't learning and how they felt the approaches to their learning were not working for them. So that was a huge part of our series. And it took us months and months and months to contact teens across Canada to speak to them. You might imagine that many teenagers were not exactly forthcoming, or that they didn't want to talk to journalists maybe necessarily about their sex lives, because we were asking very in-depth and pointed questions. But in the end, we were able to gather a sample, quite a large sample of teens across Canada, for all ages, working with a team of our reporters and our editors and also our editorial fellows that we train at the Walrus. And the result of that is about what I'm going to go into and what we learned. And we really found that there were a lot of myths out there that were not true at all, even myths that we held as editors, having researched into this and, really tried to question a lot of it. Even we had our own myths and assumptions about what we thought we would find that we found were not true at all. So that was a huge part of the series. And also say we did do a lot of other things. It's a very in-depth online series that looks at sex ed beyond the classroom. If you want to check it out, the link is up on the PowerPoint right now. In addition to talking to teens, which is the bulk of what we'll be talking about today, we also spent quite a bit of time looking at what consent would look like. As the title says, beyond the classroom. What happens? You don't stop learning about sex and sex ed. When you graduate school, it's lifelong learning. So what other questions are we missing? And what other approaches to sex and sex education and consent and healthy relationships, have we maybe overlooked? So this series looks at everything from Indigenous women and Me Too and what that means, to how to educate your daughter as a Muslim man and what that might mean, to what pleasure education could look like, to why doctors are so bad at talking about sex ed. So there's a whole breadth with multimedia. We talk to sex educators and all that sort of stuff that you can check out. But for now, what we'll be focusing on is what we learned from talking to the teens themselves. So myth number 1 is consent is too confusing for teens. And this is something that had really been in the air in Ontario that we wanted to challenge and to see if teens maybe didn't understand what consent was, or maybe they did, or what they thought it was. It was a huge argument against pushing consent within the curriculum in Ontario. People thought that, it was too confusing. Teens wouldn't understand, it would actually do more harm than good. So, what actually do teens think? So, we found out that teens have a complex understanding of consent that extends far past sexual relations and is often used to navigate daily relationships. So, what does that mean? So, I'm just going to read and explain a little bit what some teens told us. So, one 19-year-old teen in New Brunswick said, "Consent is the willingness for each party to say, 'Yes, I'm into this, excited about this.' I really do think that it's just about an excited yes, that even a hesitant yes or an I don't know is something that doesn't work. We need to show that's not consent in any form." So that's what one teen had to say. And another teen said, "Consent to me is making sure that everyone involved in an activity is comfortable and safe and happy to partake in that activity," which applies to sexual things, but also to hanging out or going for a walk. So that was a 16-year-old teen in British Columbia. So what we started to see when we were talking to these teens is that they think about consent in terms of sexual relationships, which is what a lot of the messaging and concerns around consent and understanding and how to teach it are based on. But many of the teens, in fact, I would say most of them, really surprised us by talking about consent, not just in terms of, sexual relationships and sexual assault. When we talk about the flip side of consent, they talked about it in terms of their daily relationships, their friendships. And we learned that their thinking on consent is far more complex than we ever could have thought, or that our teaching really addresses. So I'm just going to go into that a little bit too, what I mean by that. So one teen, for example, explained to me that she and her closest group of friends navigate consent in their daily friendships and their friend groups. And they didn't use it as much in sexual relationships because they weren't there yet. That wasn't part of their development yet. But they would use it, for instance, if a group of them were talking about something that maybe one of the friends wasn't as comfortable with talking about. So she used the example, maybe they were talking about what they were exploring sexually within the relationships or what they might like to explore. But also if they were just talking about family dynamics, for instance, that maybe one teen wasn't comfortable with. So within her friend group, they had a safe word. And the example that she gave me that was the safe word that month was blue. So if they began to talk about something that one of the teens wasn't comfortable with, they would just have to say blue. And then that was it. They would stop talking and move on to something else, which is a far more interesting and dynamic version of consent and what that means, and making sure everyone is engaged with that enthusiastic yes, even when they're just talking about things that, they're not navigating what a sexual relationship would look like. Another example, one teen said, I'm not saying, hey, are you free tomorrow? We're hanging out and watching a movie. So she said she wouldn't say that and come right out and say, this is what we're doing to our friend. Instead, I'm saying, hey, are you free tomorrow? I think it would be fun if we hung out. Do you want to do that? And here's another teen that said, with friendships, it's really important to ask people that you're first meeting if they're comfortable talking about certain things. If you want to ask about their family, you can always say, feel free to say no, I'm just curious about this. The idea is just to make others feel comfortable. So here we're starting to see that, and repeatedly, this pattern came up often. We would ask a very open-ended conversation. What's your understanding about consent? How do you use it in your daily relationships? And always we got back from teens that identified as, boys or girls or transgender or non-binary, gender non-conforming, the whole spectrum, they would always come back and tell us about relationships, friendships, and their sexual relationships. So they're using it on a wide spectrum, and they're really incorporating it into how they navigate these things in a very natural and helpful way, they found. So building on that, the next myth that, we found really in the air, and when we were sitting down and talking about what we would ask teens, is that boys in particular do not care about consent. And this is something that we found in criticism of consent teaching, just in the media when people were talking to parents and teens and, people in their 20s, is that boys and men, that's the problem. They don't care about consent. How can we get them to care about consent? It's seen as something that girls care about, but boys just don't get. We found, however, when we began to speak to boys, and we did speak to many boys, we spoke to the whole spectrum of genders, and we found that when given the opportunity and a judgment-free space, boys are eager to discuss consent and to apply it to their relationships. And I think what's important here that we learned is that judgment-free space. So, boys would tell us if they were in groups that were maybe community-based groups, community-funded groups, school groups even, that they felt that they're in a space where it was okay for them to talk about these things. They had quite in-depth things to say about consent and what it meant to them, and very wise things to say too about consent and what it meant to them. So we spoke to a lot of teens, in particular from a group in Calgary that some of you might be familiar with, called Wise Guys. And just a little bit about Wise Guys for some context, because we found that they were doing some very interesting things and were able to open up that conversation for boys about consent in a way that some other groups had not been able to. So Wise Guys started out of Calgary, and they say that they started because they saw disturbing trends around the cultural and media messaging about what it meant to be a man. So some of the same things that we were looking at in terms of myths. What it meant to be a man, men don't care about X, or they should not care about X. You know, to be a man, you don't care about consent. Those sort of really damaging myths that are up there. And they said we continue to see bullying and homophobia occurring in schools. Could there be a link between this bullying and homophobia and these sort of cultural and media messages about what it meant to be a man? What are we teaching our young men, and how can we change the conversation? So we spoke to participants of Wise Guys. We also spoke to boys that were on football teams, you know, captains of sports teams, you know, just to really get and start breaking through those perceptions about who cares about consent, who thinks about consent, and what it looks like for them. So here's an example. So one teen boy in BC said to us, "Consent to me probably means that my partner gives a clear thumbs up. They give a clear green light. It's important for both people to have a good time, a pleasurable time." So you see here, and you know, when he continued to speak to us, he said, he made it very clear that he knows and he understands that it's not just about him. He had a very complex understanding of consent. Another one, speaking to the idea of having sexual relations under the influence of drugs or alcohol, said consent, and this is another 17-year-old from British Columbia, consent would be if your partner or the other person is not under the influence, period. They have not taken anything, period. He or she verbally consents to wanting to have sex with you. So again, that's a very clear understanding of what consent is and what it is not also, you know. So I think that also speaks to a lot of some of the hysteria that we've seen in the media, you know, and in groups and in people speaking out saying that, you know, it's not fair to expect people, especially boys, to know that consent is free of alcohol. Everyone's drinking, you know, or they're at a party, etc., etc. But we talked to many, many teenage boys, and all of them referenced either drugs or alcohol, and how that, you know, you can't give consent if you are under the influence of those things. So they knew that clearly. It was a clear line for all the teenage boys that we spoke to. And I'll just leave that thought with one 16-year-old who told us consent is giving permission. So they know what it is and what it means to them. So building on this idea that we have, or, you know, these myths that we are breaking through about consent and who cares about what and why they care, is the third myth that we found, which is teens will do whatever feels good. So essentially, you know, teens, you know, we've all had these, I'm just going to pause and take a sip of water. We've all had and heard this messaging in our popular culture. We've heard this, you know, in the movies we watched growing up in the 80s, right till now, to, you know, those horrible things that we tell our teen girls, you know, boys only want one thing, and all these other types of myths that are really spun in to our culture on what sex ed means and what teens think about it. So this idea that, you know, teens are only looking for one thing, they're going to do whatever, they're not responsible. The truth that we found is that many teens struggle with the idea of sexual pleasure and the idea of what is supposed to feel good. And what we also found, relating back to consent, is that they also have trouble identifying what does not feel good, which, you know, as we really began to speak to them and speak to more and more teens, we realized that that's an area for alarm. That's alarming that they don't know the difference between what is supposed to feel good and what does not feel good. And it actually led us to dig into this aspect of it even further in another feature that we did. So we did a full-length feature on pleasure and why pleasure is so absent from sex ed and why that makes us uncomfortable to think about incorporating the idea of pleasure into the sex ed curriculum, but also what it can do, are the benefits it can have when we do. So I will say that I will tell you what we asked teens, and they were very uncomfortable with it. So one of our questions was, how do you define pleasurable sex or pleasurable sexual activities? How important is this to you? And I would note that, of course, there's the caveat that, there's an adult that they don't know asking them these questions, but they were very verbose on other topics, and we asked a lot of very pointed questions. But this one, they really struggled with. They had a hard time defining what it meant to them, what pleasure meant, if they cared about it, and if they ever thought about it. A lot of them were really struck by the question, and we ended up spending quite a bit of time on it with us as journalists, defining pleasure for them and trying to tell them, what we meant by that question and what pleasure could be. And so we really unpacked this. And a lot of them really, when they answered the question, came back to the idea of a healthy relationship, which is interesting because it tells us that, they don't just think about physical pleasure. They think a lot about emotional connection and how that gives them pleasure, how that makes them happy as well. So one 17-year-old boy told us when we were talking about this, and he was trying to, think about what pleasure meant, he went back to a healthy relationship. So he said they're both happy with the relationship and they love each other. And then he thought about it for a second and he said, I guess they don't have to love each other. There's open communication, trust, and ability to be yourself. That's what's important. So we're starting to see, this idea of teens thinking in very complex terms about what their relationships mean to them, what pleasure means to them, what brings them happiness, and what that would look like. Now, I just want to say a little bit more on pleasure. We learned when we did our feature that what we had seen from speaking to teens, and that they have a really difficult time defining pleasure, carried out in academic studies as well. So there's a psychology researcher at the University of New Brunswick whose name is Lucia O'Sullivan, and she found in her research that teens often experience pain during sex, but they didn't stop because they thought it was normal. She found that people between 16 and 21 years old consistently experienced problems, including pain and lack of interest. For many of them, those problems affected their lives in a substantial way. So that's going back to the beginning when we said if they can't decide what feels good, they also have trouble identifying what does not feel good. So in a survey published in 2014, she found that 50% of teenagers surveyed described a clinical level of distress when it comes to their sexual relationships. So just to think about that and to think about, challenging those ideas of what we think about teens and, why they're interested in sex. And then one 19-year-old spoke to this a little bit when she said, teachers are really missing the sex for pleasure aspect when it comes to sex education. There's a lot of stigma in discussing having sex for pleasure, especially for young women. So, again, that is cause for pause, because it teaches us that, we're talking about consent, but we're missing the idea of what's supposed to feel good, what's not supposed, what doesn't feel good. How do you voice those things and how do you begin to explore them? So moving from that, myth number 4, teens get all their information from the internet. Um, when we talk about teens not wanting to discuss sex with their parents, the assumption is that they just go to the internet and then they find all sorts of stuff. So that is both true and not true. Teens often turn to Google for answers, but just as often they have trouble distinguishing between good and bad information. So what we asked teens in this case was, where would you go if you had a question about sex or healthy relationships? If you do use the internet, how has your experience been? So in having these conversations, we learned that sometimes teens wished often, and we'll get into this a lot in the second part of the presentation that we're moving toward, is that they wish they could talk to their parents or their guardians. They wanted to have those conversations with them or with teachers, or with maybe a coach, at school. So adults that they trusted, but they often did not know how to broach those conversations. They didn't know how to have that conversation with their parent or guardian, who may have seemed standoffish or closed to that discussion as well. And when they did turn to the internet, they found that, and sometimes they'd get a question, they'd find an answer to a question that they wanted when it came to maybe contraception and things like that. But again, going back to how sex and sexual activity is supposed to feel and what feels good and what doesn't feel good, those more complex questions, they couldn't find the answers for those online. They wouldn't see those. And, they were left kind of feeling very lost when it came to that aspect of their relationships. And to sort of put that into light, there's a study that came out of Quebec that said, 40% of teens who have questions about their sexual knowledge, who feel that there are gaps in it, said that the internet is more useful than parents in providing that information. And, from our experience, we would hazard a guess that goes back to how to approach parents and what that means. And that almost a quarter of those respondents in that study said the internet was doing better at educating them than their sex education classes in school. And yet, so the flip side of this is, sure, there's lots of information on the internet. You can go and look at it without having to be embarrassed or ashamed, which are both good things. There are great resources on the internet. It's just a matter of helping teens parse between what is helpful and what is not helpful. So in terms of not helpful, about 60% couldn't identify Canada's age of consent. 40% overestimated how effective condom use is. And 27% thought it was possible to get pregnant from oral sex, anal sex, or mutual masturbation. So that gives us an idea of the other side of the coin of looking online and not necessarily finding information that is good information, which speaks to the next part. And the sort of overarching thing that we found is that teens feel that adults do not do a great job of opening this conversation in a way that is without stigma and without shame, and allows them to ask the questions that they want to ask, because they have many, many questions about sex and sexual relations and consent and all of that stuff at this time in their lives. So myth number 5 brings us right to there, and that is that teens don't want to talk to their parents or guardians about sex. So we have this idea, again, often the plot point in teen comedies and teen dramedies is this idea of the parent wanting to have the talk with their teen and the teen avoiding it, or the parent being very awkward, which we'll learn is true, and not coming across to the teen. So what we've learned, and we heard this from almost every teen that we talked to, is that they do want to talk about these things, but it is often the adult's own discomfort that gets in the way, causing them to seek information elsewhere, so the internet, or from their friends, or not seek it at all. A lot of them said after they had a hard time with their parents, they just, shut down or did not look for the question at all. So we can see how that might be problematic. So I will say that we were very surprised because we had our own, myths that we held, as journalists and, things that we've learned. So we were surprised when we spoke to teens who said they wished they could talk to a parent or guardian. We did not expect them to say that they wanted to be able to talk to their parents about these things, but their parents' own awkwardness or seeming closed-mindedness or walls that their parents put up made them feel uncomfortable and unable to do so, but they desired it. So it's interesting. It was very interesting to us, and this is from the entire series that we did, probably what made us most surprised is to learn that teens aren't dodging these conversations with their parents. They just want to have them in a very specific way that is non-confrontational and non-judgmental, and they don't want to have to worry about getting in trouble. So in fact, we actually spoke to one teen, and I'll share this, who decided they wanted to become a sex ed teacher when they grew up. And part of the reasoning behind that was that they wanted to sort of end the cycle of stigma and awkwardness that they saw was happening among themselves and their peers. And we had a very interesting conversation with this teen about, their future plans and their future life. So I'll share a little snippet from that conversation. So they said, "I want to be a sex ed teacher when I grow up. It appealed to me because sex is something that has a lot of stigma around it. The better teachers there are, the more stigma will be broken down. And the more we talk about it, the more that stigma will be broken down. With less stigma, people will be healthier and safer, and I think that's really important." So just to give you an idea, this was a 16-year-old that we were talking to, and they had a far more nuanced and open, and I would say healthier outlook on sex and sexual relations than many of the adults we spoke to for the series. So, the contrast that we started to see between teens and adults stood out really starkly when we started asking, what do the adults in your life not understand? What do they not get about consent? So we spoke to another teen who said, this was a teenage boy who talked to us about wanting to be able to talk to his parents, but not feeling comfortable, but still saying he would rather talk to an adult in his life than, go online and Google something. So he said, "I would probably feel most comfortable, though, going to a school counselor." And that was because he felt that that communication line was already open because of sex ed in school. So, those were already conversations that were taking place within his school and that he felt could continue to take place. He said, "I wouldn't want it to be one of my family members." So, that gives us an opening to start to see that teens do want to have these conversations. They aren't as embarrassed as they think we are, or as we think they are. But it's often parents themselves and adults themselves who are embarrassed. And I would say that's true even as journalists. We had a set of questions that our team was asking all of these teenagers, and we're all adults as well. And even though we're experienced journalists, I know that a lot of people on our team were, a little uncomfortable about asking the teenagers what form of contraception they used, if they, what they thought of pleasure in sex. And we had our own discomfort around those questions because we thought that the teens would be uncomfortable, or that we would, be broaching things that we shouldn't broach. And what we found was that we hardly had to, we didn't have to dance around it at all. We didn't have to coax them into anything. They were so enthusiastic and eager to finally talk about some of these things because people don't ask them, and they really wanted to have that outlet. So building off of that, one of the other big myths that we encountered was that adults know more about sex ed than the teens in their lives. And, we can look at this myth and say, well, of course adults know more about sex ed than the teens in their lives. But we found that wasn't often the case. And if we take a step back and look at the entire series that we did online, we found that a lot of adults have not grown up in this cultural environment where consent talk is encouraged and it is seen as part of everyday life. A lot of adults have not grown up in the culture where people are talking about gender and gender identity and what that means, or sexual identities and what those means, orientations, and that teens are far more savvy than the adults in their lives when it comes to these types of conversations. So, reality check, not quite. When asked about the knowledge gaps present in their teachers, parents, and guardians, teens often express frustration that adults shied away from honest, in-depth conversations on sexual and gender identities. So, if we're in Ontario, one of, the biggest things around the controversy about our sex ed curriculum was that, youth and teens were too young to start learning about these things. In certain ages they were too young, but keep in mind the teens we spoke to were from tweens, so from 12 to 19, and they all, when asked, every single one of them, when asked, what do your parents, teachers, doctors, other adults in your life not understand, but you wish they did when it came to sex ed, they all spoke about missing having conversations on sexual and gender identities. And a few of them said, my parents might be okay talking about LGBTQ issues, but they don't necessarily understand what gender nonconforming means, or gender non-binary, or gender fluidity. And those were terms and things that the teens were talking about and using and exploring as part of their daily basis. So whether they were exploring them themselves or looking at them themselves and what it meant to them, or whether their friends were, they wanted to be able to have these conversations about pronouns, about using they or their, about what it meant to transition with their parents. And they felt that those conversations especially were lacking. And we spoke to one teen who had just decided to start using they, their pronouns and to come out as gender nonconforming. So they told us, when I talked to my dad about being gay, they understood, my dad understood, we had a great conversation, there's no judgment. But when I talk now about wanting to use they, their pronouns, and this is how I feel I want to identify, their dad didn't understand, and they felt that they were educating their dad. So I'll read you a few quotes from the teens that we spoke to. One in particular was a 15-year-old who spoke about there being a huge gap in education around asexuality, and this idea of it not ever being mentioned, and a lot of teens not understanding that that's an option too, or maybe that is, their option and how they're feeling. So this was the 15-year-old. A big one they don't necessarily teach when they give the talk at school is about being asexual. Not having that brought up in many sex talks that you need to go to in school might make people think, maybe I'm not allowed to be asexual. And this idea came up repeatedly. Maybe I'm not allowed to be this. Maybe this is not an option, because it had never been discussed. And teens who identified as asexual or identified as non-binary or transgender often spoke, the ones that we spoke to, talked about how that is problematic for them, and it makes them feel that they can't be themselves or that there's something wrong with them. So here's another one that we heard from. I feel that the sex ed I get in school is actually very good. They use gender neutral language when talking about everything. They don't talk about sex with a penis and a vagina. So they were saying they liked that. They liked that approach. But then they went on to say that outside of school, so when they're talking to parents or other adults in their lives, that's where things sort of start to fall apart. So even with people who know it's not only that, so even with people, they're saying that, they know they have, they're not closed-minded, is spoken about as a heterosexual thing. Sometimes people will mention other pairings or couples, but it's almost like an afterthought. Like there's sex, and then there's queer sex, which doesn't really count. So this just shows you what teens are working through, and the conversations they're having. They're so much more advanced than us in these conversations, and it's really the adults that they feel are lagging behind. So that brings us to myth 7, which is what we've been building up toward as we talk about this and talk about what teens, what we think teens know and talk about and want to know and what they actually do. So myth 7, teens don't want to learn about sex ed in school. So this myth, we've all seen it. We all know that it exists. This idea that if we didn't force teens to learn about sex ed, they wouldn't go. They don't care. It's a fluff class. It's a bird course. It's not something that they're actually invested in. Quite the opposite, we found. So teens are eager to learn about sex ed, and to its fullest extent. So, and what that means is everything that we've just talked about. They want to learn about sexual and gender identity. They had many questions about pleasure. They had questions about contraception. Consent, as we've learned, is much more complex than we might have guessed. And they spoke with great knowledge about healthy relationship dynamics and what that means and how they can achieve them, what that might look like in their own lives. So when we asked them, we had also expected, we were so surprised by everything that we learned, and all the teens that we spoke to. We just kept walking away from our interviews with them thinking, like, wow, we did not expect that. They are so much further along in their thinking than we are. It's such a part of their daily lives in a way that it never was when we were younger. And often isn't now among adults. We're not having as in-depth, complex conversations as the ones that these teens are having. So when we ask them, what do you want to learn about sex ed? What would your ideal sex education look like? They had many, many ideas about what that would be. So one teen told us, my sexual education was all about learning the names of reproductive systems, the biological act of having sex, instead of when do you think you should be having sex? Why are you having sex? Are you ready to have sex? Those are the kinds of conversations I would have liked. So this is coming from a 19-year-old who recently graduated high school. And she was telling us she had just started, we spoke to her during her first or second week of university, and she was saying how unprepared she felt that she was for the conversations that were happening on her campus that she didn't or had never had in high school. So she went on to say, I would also have liked to have learned about these questions. How do you know it's okay? So how do you know it's okay to have sex or to have this sexual experience that you're about to have? Does this person want to have sex with you? How do we learn those things? I don't think we really talked about that. Adults don't talk about the emotional side, what it means to have sex for the first time. So this was something that she was also navigating. You might feel really vulnerable, or you might just be nervous, just because people build it up to be a really big deal. I definitely wish I had had that when I was in junior high or high school. So this is something that we encountered a lot. So we either had people or teens that we interviewed that were still in school across the country, and we're starting to have these nuanced conversations, and we're saying the adults and the teachers and their lives weren't necessarily catching up to them. Maybe they were trying, maybe some of it was there, and they were going elsewhere to have more in-depth conversations about these things. And then, so, that we took to be very positive. So teens that, they're still maybe savvier than we think and having these more nuanced conversations that we might have guessed, but they're saying the start of those conversations are happening at school. We're learning the beginnings of what we need to know from school. But then we spoke to another group, so it was either one or the other usually, and the other group was like this 19-year-old whose quote I just shared, saying, I didn't learn these things in school, and now I don't feel prepared. And saying, this is what I wished that I had learned. I wished that, it wasn't just about anatomy. I wish it wasn't just about mechanics of things. I wish that we had talked about things more in depth and with more nuance, and that we had talked about emotions and what that means, that we had talked about not just how to navigate consent, but what if, consent doesn't look like so cut and dry, what if someone has been drinking? What if you're not sure if someone's giving an enthusiastic yes? How do you actually have those conversations when it comes down to it? When you're in that situation, what might that look like? What might it feel like to have sex for the first time? What are some of the things that you would deal with after? And how do you know it's okay? How do you know you're okay after it? So all these questions that teens have that, they're desperately seeking answers to, especially as they grow up. And we were starting to see the connecting lines between having holes in your education when you're younger, and then having those holes continue on when you're older. And, on the flip side of that, having teens that are growing up that already know what healthy relationships look like and who are already making healthy choices. So when we talk about the takeaways from all of these many, many conversations we have, it wasn't only myths and breaking those myths that we saw repeated throughout the conversations that we began to draw patterns with. It was teens' own advice to adults on how to improve sex ed, which we started asking teens because they had so much to say about what adults could do better, and they were happy to share with us about what that might mean. So one of those was to facilitate more open, non-judgmental conversations about gender identity. This was a big one, and it's one that came up across the spectrum. And they wanted, parents to talk about these things without judgment, to bring them up in conversation, to normalize them, basically, and to remove the stigma. And it's important to note that, that was especially present with teens we spoke with whose parents maybe didn't want them to receive sex ed. who were concerned about sexual education. You know, those teens still wanted to learn, and they still wanted to have those conversations because those conversations are happening in the school hallways, they're happening in pop culture, they're happening anyway. They want to have them with someone that they trust. Another big takeaway that we learned was that parents should arm themselves with knowledge before they talk to their teens and help teens to access information without shame. So what that means is we all hear about the talk, you know, that you sit down with your teen and have the talk with them. But you might find, and teens say they have a lot more questions that go beyond what that basic idea of the talk is for a lot of parents. And they have so many questions that they need answers to, but they're too embarrassed to ask their parents because their parents in turn seem too embarrassed to talk about it. So it's, you know, we're kind of stuck in this cycle. And they said, you know, if my parents approached it differently, they would be the first person that I would turn to, or my guardian or my teacher. So that's something to think about as well. And then going back to pleasure, we really learned, and teens had a lot to say after our conversations with them on pleasure, about how a pleasure-based education does go hand in hand with effective learning about consent. And this can be quite a radical idea. We don't often talk about what a pleasure-based education would look like in school, you know, especially in Ontario, but also in other provinces we discovered where a lot of sex education and what's considered progressive sex education is under attack. Asking someone to think about incorporating pleasure when, you know, they have a hard time incorporating other things that are much less controversial can be difficult. But we found that that was something that teens really lacked an understanding about, is what pleasure would be like. And then they said, you know, further, when they started thinking about it, how can we possibly know what we're consenting to when we have no idea that it's supposed to feel good? And then one of the other points was, don't assume you know more than the teen you're talking to. Ask them what they have to teach you. So this was very important. A lot of teens really felt that they knew more than their parents, and they probably did. I don't think it was just how we all as teenagers think we know more than our parents. You know, they really had a more advanced knowledge about incorporating consent into friendship-based relationships. How consent can be that flexible tool, and how it can be a framework for many types of relationships. They had a lot to say about that, you know, that their parents weren't there yet or weren't talking about. Teens also had a lot to say about gender identity and what that would look like, and how that's so fluid to them, and how that's just a part of how they navigate that now. You know, they have a lot to teach the adults in their lives about this, and they're really ready to share it. And then lastly, one of our big takeaways was and this feels so obvious, but it became even more obvious after spending months and months talking to teenagers about sex and sexual relationships and healthy relationships, which is just healthy sexual relationships are a key part of healthy lives. You know, teens that grow up, and we also talk to many parents and adults for this series was very expansive, so we talked to, you know, many other people about where they felt it went wrong. You know, if they didn't have a healthy sexual relationship or a healthy attitude toward sex and consent. And they said it was, you know, when they were younger, when those gaps happened when they were younger, and it's hard to dig out of them. You know, we don't stop navigating consent or sex when we're older, but we do talk about it less. And if we can start making those conversations a part of our normal communications with teens, they will in turn become part of our normal communications when we're adults and in our own relationships. So I think we're going to move to questions now. We have about 6 minutes before we stop. So where did the myths come from, and who identified them was one of our first questions. So that came within our editorial team, talking we talked to probably hundreds of people for the whole series, and these are the myths that kept coming up. The ones that we saw in media about the controversies, or what we didn't want our kids to learn, or what we thought the kids were learning. So those myths, and then myths that we identified through our research and in our conversations with people, and what the ones that kept reoccurring. So we do have time for another question if anyone wants to type something in. Did we interview anyone from the territories? We did. So we spoke to people from coast to coast to coast, and we also have separate breakout stories. If you look at our series that look at how the Inuit and how in Nunavut they're approaching sex ed from a totally different outlook than we see elsewhere in Canada, through art, through traditional mask making, through throat singing, and what that looks like, and how that also is very teen directed. So it's a very cool project that they're doing in Nunavut if you do want to check out the larger series and what that looks like. Okay, I think we are done. Yes, all right. Thank you everyone for your time. And thank you for tuning into the webinar.